Music is a language. How do we acquire our languages? Well, mother tongue, by ear. And then we are taught how to write and read. The language we learn by ear. And the fact is that not all people who learn how to read and write the language they already speak by ear become writers. But they can write in order to exercise their thinking, their analysis, their understanding of and through the language of the world. And when they acquire secondary languages after the mother tongue, then they exponentially expand their understanding of other not only idioms but innuendos and sounds that correspond to other meanings, since the purpose of the language is to communicate concepts. But the choice of the words can lead to secondary innuendos that can lead to other, beyond the purpose of the meaning of it, ways of developing the ideas and the stories and the thoughts that you're communicating. It's a paradox because the phonemes on their own are sounds, vowels and consonants. But when we hear somebody speak a foreign language, it disconnects itself from the meaning if we don't speak it. Therefore, we hear only the sounds of it, which puzzles us and at best surprise us, but we cannot guess how the diphthongs are related to the meaning that is conveyed in this language. Let less if it's poetry, which by essence is the music of the words of a given language beyond the meaning, or then other levels of meaning of the same words when used poetically in such way. And same thing about music language. It has a communality because in the past music was constricted to its own region geographically, time. Most people died by their 30s, and most music of the past was not accessible through libraries and awareness because it was the immediacy of the present that needed to be musically lived with commissions, with performances. Nobody asked Mozart to play Bach or Chopin to play Beethoven. It's only Liszt and later Rachmaninoff who started playing other composers on stage. That concept of a recital was foreign. They invited the performers to play their own music because it goes by itself. And therefore, if the different composers of the post-1950s developed individual languages which made them hermetic to the general language that was commonly shared through the tonal system with all its alterations, then in order to taste the beauties, the meaning, and the atmospheres and the moods and all the innuendos and subtleties, you have to learn the language. Therefore, it's no more like the mother tongue by ear. It becomes like a second language which you learn by the book. And therefore, with the grammar and the syntax and the meaning of how you develop your thought in this language in order to manage to understand. And if each composer has its hermetic language of their own, you have to study them all. And of course, you have translators, by essence, interpreters. That's the word meaning of interpretation is translation. Then translate originally the music from the marked markings on the score to the livelihood of the performance, but also the language of a composer to be understood by an audience. So you become, as a performer of a lesser known composer, you become spokesman or spokeswoman of this composer. And of course, if people know the piece, then they judge of how you play the piece. But if they listen to a piece they don't know, then you become the vector of this piece, and you have to convince them as well as charm them and eventually seduce them with it. At whichever level of intellectual or emotional attraction this conveys. And sometimes both, if it's a dance, a prayer, a song, a fugue, a polyphony, a string quartet, a chorale. On the piano you can sort of play a little bit of all, included orchestra pieces or choral pieces, but then you suggest it with voicing, what you bring out or not in shadows and lights, chiaroscuro, rather than orchestra colors, which sort of give the indication by the instruments themselves. So at all levels, it's a translation from the instrumental, from the stylistic, from the time period. It's almost like as if when I, years ago, was asked to do a reconstruction of unconnected sketches of an 18-year-old Glenn Gould for his piano sonata by his record company after his death, to restore it, and therefore I had to recompose it. How do I know that I did what he would have done had he wanted to do it? Or revisit it? He died at 50, so he could have recomposed later again, or something totally different. So therefore, I revisited the young Gould's unconnected dots, which are markings for himself, so he can organize his thoughts, and he chose to abandon it then. And he didn't, therefore, expect it to exist. His publisher of the record label wanted to celebrate him, so they asked me to do this sort of archaeological work. And so if I guess by logic, I can say, yes, I combine dots and I imagine how this development of the thought would have happened. But this is only a logical assumption, not necessarily the one a composer uses. By essence, the author surprises us by hearing something we didn't hear. If not, we can mechanically make copies of a style we analyzed by imitating it, a pastiche or an homage. But generally, when you play a piece which already exists written in a form that is more or less definitive, and the performers play something written by other people for other time periods, for listeners who are from their own time period, inevitably then all these innuendos about how to play the unmeasured elements of the score become a question of argument about who is stylistically correct and what are the criteria and who pretends to know. So you have, in the contemporary way of learning music, the musicologists who study musicology, the performers who study literally reciting, performing published scores, and hear recordings of the pieces by other people of the same pieces. And then you have composers who don't play and who imagine music that is played by others, with few exceptions when the performer is the composer, and then it's invisibilized by the composers who prefer the pianist to play their own compositions, or then the other pianists consider that being a composer is thinking outside of the box, therefore not respectful of the detail as the performer is, to assumingly less than the performer to respect the text, when in fact, even without to be an active composer, all performers should think as a composer, analytically, intuitively, pianistically. Some composers who were pianists themselves left us pieces where they composed it with their fingers, their own morphology of fingers, and others conceptually, because they were not full pianists in the sense of virtuosity like Schumann through Clara, but not directly. And Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Mettner, Liszt, Chopin were writing through their hands. Literally, their pianistic hands, thinking. And it's normal because they are the craftsmen of their art. And if they're sculptors, is how they carve, and if they're painters, is how they paint, and therefore if they're pianists, is how they piano. And therefore I think that if we are taught how to speak by ear, but read and write by reflection on our own, the language we received as a mother tongue, I think that through musical grammar, call it ear training, solfege, keyboard harmony, polyphony, contrapoint, fugue, we learn the syntax of music that we serve by reciting it faithfully. But we think also how it's organized, how the transition organized, where modulations occur, in which key we go, where the subject or the theme comes in, how do we organize the construction of it while we play it, beyond the notation and the tempo marking, and how others played, and how we are inspired by some artists who are performers. I find it fascinating because if we reduce the performer to only play by ear, then they don't know exactly in real time, without GPS, in which key they are. They know it by their fingers, but not necessarily by their awareness of not only the tonalities, by the harmonic, if there is in that time period of the music a harmonic structure, what is the structure of the progression. And so it's equivalent to a GPS, so you know where you're navigating in the piece and how you organize it, even if it's organized, or perhaps it's written to sound in this notation as improvised, which is the case also, since most music in the past was improvised and a small percentage of it was notated. And today we can revisit music of so many time periods, so we learn how to read, how to guess, how to organize, how to reproduce, how to play on modern instruments, or we shouldn't, or if we do, then why and how. Music of the time, but we don't have not only the instruments change, but the ears and the psyche and the expectation of what is a suspension and tension and a release and a consonance after a dissonance, and how that means a tension release of a phrasing, and is it related to imaginary syllables or bowings or breathing of instruments or voice. On an instrument like the piano, that the essence essentially doesn't need any of these limitations for the tempo. But on the other hand, it also gives the drive of the structure of the phrasing, of the group of lines, of the group of bars, of the beats, not the tempo or the rhythm, but the pace. And the pace is an impression, an illusion sometimes, depending if you bring out the fast notes or the lesser fast notes, if you play a slow tempo with decaying tones, and how you take in account the decay. And the decay then creates its own tempo choice, because then the connection of the sounds becomes intuitive. And if not with the pedal, you can extend it, but a singer, a wind instrument player, or a bowed string instrument player, they don't have that luxury. So they have to find a way to narratively say the sentence. Of course, most of them play single voice instruments by essence. And when you play polyphony, then it becomes harmonized, or if not, post-harmony with some kind of tonal centers or whatever it is. The language evolves, but the structure commands its own understanding, and then you become, as a performer, the defender of this music, of this language, of this meaning. I think it's essential that we all think as composers when we play a piece that's written, even if we don't compose on the side. And that necessarily, of course, we don't recompose the piece itself, but we understand, therefore, some kind of a red thread, or whichever color you wanted to call it, that connects the dots of how the musical thought of the composer unveils. Surprisingly or expectedly. Like when I reproduced the thoughts of Gould when I was asked, I thought if I do it logically, it might be too obvious, and if I do it illogically, I don't know which illogic he would have used. In other words, we cannot second guess. But when we perform the music that is already written and recorded by others and taught by MOST and published by publishers who give us the original text, then we are sort of bound to a certain level of recitation. But it has to be a recitation that is a convinced recitation, because then you become convincing because you're convinced. And I think that this comes through learning how to read and write a score, even if you recite precisely what is on the score that you respect of the composer's choice. All these things are very important because it's too easy and restrictive to say, just play and don't think, or think but don't play, organize but publish and then others play. In other words, there is an immediacy in the performance that is not the immediacy of the composer or the musicologist. We have time to ponder upon it. And I find that during practicing, a performer practices the muscular technique memory to remember how to shift, play, organize. The fingers on the piano, for instance, since we don't have to deal with pitch and in vibrato, alas, but that's the way it is, the instrument. Then we can also think about, since we have to organize so many elements, how we do it as a conductor, imagining the score in terms of its texture and pulse and pace. I think we have to think as if we are writers, but we can write without to become creative writers ourselves necessarily. It's not excluded. As a matter of fact, I encourage it on the side as well, as to respect the piece, as to think how it could have gone if it was written with a different direction of the development of the thought. But you still play it like it's written. But thinking outside the box doesn't mean that you don't respect the box. In other words, serving earnestly the muse.